Chapter 4 of Freya of the Seven Isles by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Dann. Freya of the Seven Isles, Chapter 4. I suppose praiseworthy motives are a sufficient justification almost for anything. What could be more commendable in the abstract than a girl's determination that poor papa should not be worried, and her anxiety that the man of her choice should be kept by any means from every occasion of doing something rash, something which might endanger the whole scheme of their happiness? Nothing could be more tender and more prudent. We must also remember the girl's self-reliant temperament and the general unwillingness of women, I mean women of sense, to make a fuss over matters of that sort. As has been said already, Heemskirk turned up some time after Jasper's arrival at Nelson's Cove. The sight of the brig lying right under the bungalow was very offensive to him. He did not fly ashore before his anchor touched the ground, as Jasper used to do. On the contrary, he hung about his quarter-deck mumbling to himself, and when he ordered his boat to be manned, it was in an angry voice. Freya's existence, which lifted Jasper out of himself into a blissful elation, was for Heemskirk a cause of secret torment, of hours of exasperated brooding. While passing the brig, he hailed her harshly and asked if the master was on board. Schultz, smart and neat in a spotless white suit, leant over the taffrail, finding the question somewhat amusing. He looked humorously down into Heemskirk's boat and answered in the most amiable modulations of his beautiful voice, "Captain Allen is up at the house, sir." But his expression changed suddenly at the savage growl, "What the devil are you grinning at?" which acknowledged that information. He watched Heemskirk land, and instead of going to the house, stride away by another path into the grounds. The desire-tormented Dutchman found old Nelson, or Nielsen, at his drying sheds, very busy superintending the manipulation of his tobacco crop, which, though small, was of excellent quality, and enjoying himself thoroughly. But Heemskirk soon put a stop to this simple happiness. He sat down by the old chap, and by the sort of talk which he knew was best calculated for the purpose, reduced him before long to a state of concealed and perspiring nervousness. It was a horrid talk of authorities, and old Nelson tried to defend himself. If he dealt with English traders, it was because he had to dispose of his produce somehow. He was as conciliatory as he knew how to be, and this very thing seemed to excite Heemskirk, who had worked himself up into a heavily breathing state of passion. "And the worst of them all is that Allen," he growled. "Your particular friend, eh? You have let in a lot of these Englishmen into this part. You ought never to have been allowed to settle here. Never. What's he doing here now?" Old Nelson, or Nielsen, becoming very agitated, declared that Jasper Allen was no particular friend of his, no friend at all, at all. He had bought 3 tons of rice for him to feed his workpeople on. What sort of evidence of friendship was that? Heemskirk burst out at last with a thought that had been gnawing at his victuals. "Yes, sell 3 tons of rice, and flirt 3 days with that girl of yours. I'm speaking to you as a friend, Nielsen. This won't do. You are only on sufferance here." Old Nelson was taken aback at first, but recovered pretty quickly. "Won't do? Certainly. Of course it wouldn't do. The last man in the world. But his girl didn't care for the fellow, and was too sensible to fall in love with anyone." He was very earnest in impressing on Heemskirk his own feeling of absolute security. And the lieutenant, casting doubting glances sideways, was yet willing to believe him. "Much you know about it," he grunted nevertheless. "But I do know," insisted old Nelson with greater desperation, because he wanted to resist the doubts arising in his own mind. "My own daughter, in my own house, and I not to know? Come, it would be a good joke, Lieutenant." "They seem to be carrying on considerably," remarked Heemskirk moodily. "I suppose they are together now," he added, feeling a pang which changed what he meant for a mocking smile into a strange grimace. The harassed Nelson shook his head at him. He was, at bottom, shocked at this insistence, and was even beginning to feel annoyed at the absurdity of it. "Pah, pah! I tell you what, Lieutenant, you go to the house and have a drop of gin and bitters before dinner. Ask for Freya. I must see the last of this tobacco put away for the night, but I'll be along presently." Heemskirk was not insensible to this suggestion. It answered to his secret longing, which was not a longing for drink, however. Old Nelson shouted solicitously after his broad back a recommendation to make himself comfortable, and that there was a box of cheroots on the veranda. It was the west veranda that old Nelson meant, the one which was the living room of the house and had split rattan screens of the very finest quality. The east veranda, sacred to his own privacy, puffing out of cheeks and other signs of perplexed thinking, was fitted with stout blinds of sailcloth. The north veranda was not a veranda at all, really. It was more like a long balcony. It did not communicate with the other two, and could only be approached by a passage inside the house. Thus it had a privacy which made it a convenient place for a maiden's meditations without words, and also for the discourses, apparently without sense, which, passing between a young man and a maid, become pregnant with a diversity of transcendental meanings. The north veranda was embowered with climbing plants. Freya, whose room opened out on it, had furnished it as a sort of boudoir for herself, with a few cane chairs and a sofa of the same kind. On this sofa she and Jasper sat, as close together as is possible in this imperfect world, where neither can a body be in two places at once, nor yet two bodies can be in one place at the same time. They had been sitting together all the afternoon, and I won't say that their talk had been without sense. Loving him with a little judicious anxiety lest in his elation he should break his heart over some mishap, Freya naturally would talk to him soberly. He, nervous and brusque when away from her, appeared always as if overcome by her visibility, by the great wonder of being palpably loved. An old man's child, having lost his mother early, thrown out to sea, out of the way while very young, he had not much experience of tenderness of any kind. In this private, foliage-embowered veranda, and at this late hour of the afternoon, he bent down a little, and possessing himself of Freya's hands, was kissing them one after another, while she smiled and looked down at his head with the eyes of approving compassion. At that same moment Heemskirk was approaching the house from the north. Antonia was on the watch on that side, but she did not keep a very good watch. The sun was setting. She knew that her young mistress and the captain of the Bonito were about to separate. She was walking to and fro in the dusky grove with a flower in her hair and singing softly to herself, when suddenly, within a foot of her, the lieutenant appeared from behind a tree. She bounded aside like a startled fawn, but Heemskirk, with a lucid comprehension of what she was there for, pounced upon her, and catching her arm, clasped his other thick hand over her mouth. "If you try to make a noise, I'll twist your neck." This ferocious figure of speech terrified the girl sufficiently. Heemskirk had seen plainly enough on the veranda Freya's golden head with another head very close to it. He dragged the unresisting maid with him by a circuitous way into the compound, where he dismissed her with a vicious push in the direction of the cluster of bamboo huts for the servants. She was very much like the faithful camerista of Italian comedy, but in her terror she bolted away without a sound from that thick, short, black-eyed man with a cruel grip of fingers like a vice. Quaking all over at a distance, extremely scared and half inclined to laugh, she saw him enter the house at the back. The interior of the bungalow was divided by two passages crossing each other in the middle. At that point Heemskirk, by turning his head slightly to the left as he passed, secured the evidence of carrying on so irreconcilable with old Nelson's assurances that it made him stagger with a rush of blood to his head. Two white figures, distinct against the light, stood in an unmistakable attitude. Freya's arms were round Jasper's neck. Their faces were characteristically superimposed on each other, and Heemskirk went on, his throat choked with a sudden rising of curses, till on the west veranda he stumbled blindly against a chair and then dropped into another, as though his legs had been swept from under him. He had indulged too long in the habit of appropriating Freya to himself in his thoughts. "Is that how you entertain your visitors, he thought, so outraged that he could not find a sufficiently degrading epithet. Freya struggled a little and threw her head back. "Somebody has come in," she whispered. Jasper, holding her clasped closely to his breast and looking down into her face, suggested casually, "Your father." Freya tried to disengage herself, but she had not the heart absolutely to push him away with her hands. "I believe it's Heemskirk," she breathed out at him. He, plunging into her eyes in a quiet rapture, was provoked to a vague smile by the sound of the name. "The ass is always knocking down my beacons outside the river," he murmured. He attached no other meaning to Heemskirk's existence, but Freya was asking herself whether the lieutenant had seen them. "Let me go, kid," she ordered in a peremptory whisper. Jasper obeyed, and stepping back at once, continued his contemplation of her face under another angle. "I must go and see," she said to herself anxiously. She instructed him hurriedly to wait a moment after she was gone, and then to slip onto the back veranda and get a quiet smoke before he showed himself. "Don't stay late this evening," was her last recommendation before she left him. Then Freya came out on the west veranda with her light, rapid step. While going through the doorway, she managed to shake down the folds of the looped-up curtains at the end of the passage so as to cover Jasper's retreat from the bower. Directly she appeared, Heemskirk jumped up as if to fly at her. She paused, and he made her an exaggerated low bow. It irritated Freya. "Oh, it's you, Mr. Heemskirk. How do you do?" She spoke in her usual tone. Her face was not plainly visible to him in the dusk of the deep veranda. He dared not trust himself to speak. His rage at what he had seen was so great. And when she added with serenity, "Papa will be coming in before long," he called her horrid name silently to himself before he spoke with contorted lips. "I have seen your father already. We had a talk in the sheds. He told me some very interesting things." "Oh, very." Freya sat down. She thought, "He has seen us for certain." She was not ashamed. What she was afraid of was some foolish or awkward complication. But she could not conceive how much her person had been appropriated by Heemskirk in his thoughts. She tried to be conversational. "You are coming now from Palembang, I suppose?" "Eh, what? Oh, yes, I come from Palembang." "Ha ha! You know what your father said? He said he was afraid you were having a very dull time of it here." "And I suppose you're going to cruise in the Moluccas?" continued Freya, who wanted to impart some useful information to Jasper, if possible. At the same time, she was always glad to know that those two men were a few hundred miles apart when not under her eyes. Heemskirk growled angrily. "Yes, Moluccas," glaring in the direction of her shadowy figure. "Your father thinks it's very quiet for you here. I tell you what, Miss Freya, there isn't a quiet spot on earth that a woman can't find an opportunity of making a fool of somebody." Freya thought, "I mustn't let him provoke me." Presently the Tamil boy, who was Nelson's head servant, came in with the lights. She addressed him at once with voluble directions where to put the lamps, told him to bring the tray with the gin and bitters, and to send Antonia into the house. "I will have to leave you to yourself, Mr. Heemskirk, for a while," she said. And she went to her room to put on another frock. She made a quick change of it because she wished to be on the veranda before her father and the lieutenant met again. She relied on herself to regulate that evening's intercourse between these two. But Antonia, still scared and hysterical, exhibited a bruise on her arm which roused Freya's indignation. "He jumped on me out of the bush like a tiger," said the girl, laughing nervously with frightened eyes. "The brute," thought Freya. "He meant to spy on us then." She was enraged, but the recollection of the thick Dutchman in white trousers, wide at the hips and narrow at the ankles, with his shoulder straps and black bullet head, glaring at her in the light of the lamps, was so repulsively comical that she could not help a smiling grimace. Then she became anxious. The absurdities of three men were forcing this anxiety upon her. Jasper's impetuosity, her father's fears, Heemskirk's infatuation. She was very tender to the first two, and she made up her mind to display all her feminine diplomacy. "All this," she said to herself, "will be over and done with before very long now." Heemskirk, on the veranda, lolling in a chair, his legs extended and his white cap reposing on his stomach, was lashing himself into a fury of an atrocious character altogether incomprehensible to a girl like Freya. His chin was resting on his chest, his eyes gazed stonily at his shoes. Freya examined him from behind the curtain. He didn't stir. He was ridiculous, but this absolute stillness was impressive. She stole back along the passage to the east veranda, where Jasper was sitting quietly in the dark, doing what he was told like a good boy. "Psst!" she hissed. He was by her side in a moment. "Yes, what is it?" he murmured. "It's that beetle," she whispered uneasily. Under the impression of Heemskirk's sinister immobility, she had half a mind to let Jasper know that they had been seen. But she was by no means certain that Heemskirk would tell her father, and at any rate not that evening. She concluded rapidly that the safest thing would be to get Jasper out of the way as soon as possible. "What has he been doing?" asked Jasper in a calm undertone. "Oh, nothing. He sits there looking cross, but you know how he's always worrying Papa." "Your father's quite unreasonable," pronounced Jasper judicially. "I don't know," she said in a doubtful tone. Something of old Nelson's dread of the authorities had rubbed off on the girl since she had to live with it day after day. "I don't know. Papa's afraid of being reduced to beggary, as he says, in his old days. Look here, kid, you'd better clear out tomorrow, first thing." Jasper had hoped for another afternoon with Freya, an afternoon of quiet felicity with the girl by his side and his eyes on his brig, anticipating a blissful future. His silence was eloquent with disappointment, and Freya understood it very well. She too was disappointed, but it was her business to be sensible. "We shan't have a moment to ourselves with that beetle creeping round the house," she argued in a low, hurried voice. "So what's the good of your staying? And he won't go while the brig's here, you know he won't." "He ought to be reported for loitering," murmured Jasper with a vexed little laugh. "Mind you get under way at daylight," recommended Freya under her breath. He detained her after the manner of lovers. She expostulated without struggling because it was hard for her to repulse him. He whispered into her ear while he put his arms round her. "Next time we two meet, next time I hold you like this, it shall be on board. You and I, in the brig, all the world, all the life." And then he flashed out, "I wonder I can wait. I feel as if I must carry you off now at once. I would run with you in my hands, down the path, without stumbling, without touching the earth." She was still. She listened to the passion in his voice. She was saying to herself that if she were to whisper the faintest yes, if she were but to sigh lightly her consent, he would do it. He was capable of doing it, without touching the earth. She closed her eyes and smiled in the dark, abandoning herself in a delightful giddiness for an instant to his encircling arm. But before he could be tempted to tighten his grasp, she was out of it, a foot away from him, and in full possession of herself. That was the steady Freya. She was touched by the deep sigh which floated up to her from the white figure of Jasper, who did not stir. "You are a mad kid," she said tremulously. Then, with a change of tone, "No one could carry me off, not even you. I am not the sort of girl that gets carried off." His white form seemed to shrink a little before the force of that assertion, and she relented. "Isn't it enough for you to know that you have carried me away?" she added in a tender tone. He murmured an endearing word, and she continued, "I've promised you. I've said I would come, and I shall come of my own free will. You shall wait for me on board. I shall get up by the side, by myself, and walk up to you on the deck and say, 'Here I am, kid.' And then I shall be carried off. But it will be no man who will carry me off. It will be the brig, your brig, our brig. I love the beauty." She heard an inarticulate sound, something like a moan wrung out by pain or delight, and glided away. There was that other man on the other veranda, that dark, surly Dutchman who could make trouble between Jasper and her father, bring about a quarrel, ugly words, and perhaps a physical collision. What a horrible situation! But even putting aside that awful extremity, she shrank from having to live for some 3 months with a wretched, tormented, angry, distracted, absurd man. And when the day came, the day and the hour, what should she do if her father tried to detain her by main force, as was, after all, possible? Could she actually struggle with him hand to hand? But it was of lamentations and entreaties that she was really afraid. Could she withstand them? What an odious, cruel, ridiculous position that would be. But it won't be. He'll say nothing, she thought, as she came out quickly on the west veranda, and seeing that Heemskirk did not move, sat down on a chair near the doorway and kept her eyes on him. The outraged lieutenant had not changed his attitude, only his cap had fallen off his stomach and was lying on the floor. His thick black eyebrows were knitted by a frown, while he looked at her out of the corners of his eyes, and their sideways glance in conjunction with the hooked nose, The whole bulky, ungainly, sprawling person struck Freya as so comically moody that, inwardly discomposed as she was, she could not help smiling. She did her best to give that smile a conciliatory character. She did not want to provoke Heemskerk needlessly. And the lieutenant, perceiving that smile, was mollified. It never entered his head that his outward appearance, a naval officer in uniform, could appear ridiculous to that girl of no position, the daughter of old Nielsen. The recollection of her arms round Jasper's neck still irritated and excited him. The hussy, he thought, smiling, eh? That's how you're amusing yourself, fooling your father finely, aren't you? You have a taste for that sort of fun, have you? Well, we shall see. He did not alter his position, but on his pursed-up lips there also appeared a smile of snarly and ill-omened amusement, while his eyes returned to the contemplation of his boots. Freya felt hot with indignation. She sat radiantly fair in the lamplight, her strong, well-shaped hands lying one on top of the other in her lap. Odious creature, she thought. Her face coloured with sudden anger. "You have scared my maid out of her senses," she said aloud. "What possessed you?" He was thinking so deeply of her that the sound of her voice, pronouncing these unexpected words, startled him extremely. He jerked up his head and looked so bewildered that Freya insisted impatiently. "I mean Antonia. You've bruised her arm. What did you do it for?" "Do you want to quarrel with me?" he asked thickly, with a sort of amazement. He blinked like an owl. It was funny. Freya, like all women, had a keen sense of the ridiculous in outward appearance. "Well, no, I don't think I do." She could not help herself. She laughed outright, a clear, nervous laugh in which Heemskerk joined suddenly with a harsh "ha ha ha." Voices and footsteps were heard in the passage, and Jasper, with old Nelson, came out. Old Nelson looked at his daughter approvingly, for he liked the lieutenant to be kept in good humour. And he also joined sympathetically in the laugh. "Now, Lieutenant, we shall have some dinner," he said, rubbing his hands cheerily. Jasper had gone straight to the balustrade. The sky was full of stars, and in the blue, velvety night, the cove below had a denser blackness, in which the riding lights of the brig and of the gunboat glimmered redly like suspended sparks. "Next time this riding light glimmers down there, I'll be waiting for her on the quarter-deck to come and say, 'Here I am,'" Jasper thought, and his heart seemed to grow bigger in his chest, dilated by an oppressive happiness that nearly wrung out a cry from him. There was no wind, not a leaf below him stirred, and even the sea was but a still, uncomplaining shadow. Far away on the unclouded sky, the pale lightning, the heat lightning of the tropics, played tremulously amongst the low stars in short, faint, mysteriously consecutive flashes, like incomprehensible signals from some distant planet. The dinner passed off quietly. Freya sat facing her father, calm but pale. Heemskerk affected to talk only to old Nelson. Jasper's behaviour was exemplary. He kept his eyes under control, basking in the sense of Freya's nearness, as people bask in the sun without looking up to heaven. And very soon after dinner was over, mindful of his instructions, he declared that it was time for him to go on board his ship. Heemskerk did not look up. Ensconced in the rocking-chair and puffing at a cheroot, he had the air of meditating surlily over some odious outbreak. So at least it seemed to Freya. Old Nelson said at once, "I'll stroll down with you." He had begun a professional conversation about the dangers of the New Guinea coast, and wanted to relate to Jasper some experience of his own over there. Jasper was such a good listener. Freya made as if to accompany them, but her father frowned, shook his head, and nodded significantly towards the immovable Heemskerk, blotting out smoke with half-closed eyes and protruded lips. The lieutenant must not be left alone. Take offence, perhaps. Freya obeyed these signs. "Perhaps it is better for me to stay," she thought. Women are not generally prone to review their own conduct, still less to condemn it. The embarrassing masculine absurdities are, in the main, responsible for its ethics. But, looking at Heemskerk, Freya felt regret and even remorse. His thick bulk in repose suggested the idea of repletion, but as a matter of fact he had eaten very little. He had drunk a great deal, however. The fleshy lobes of his unpleasant big ears with deeply folded rims were crimson. They quite flamed in the neighbourhood of the flat, sallow cheeks. For a considerable time he did not raise his heavy brown eyelids. To be at the mercy of such a creature was humiliating, and Freya, who always ended by being frank with herself, thought regretfully, if only I'd been open with Papa from the first. But then, what an impossible life he would have led me. Yes, men were absurd in many ways, lovably like Jasper, impracticably like her father, odiously like that grotesquely supine creature in the chair. Was it possible to talk him over? Perhaps it was not necessary. Oh, I can't talk to him, she thought. And when Heemskirk, still without looking at her, began resolutely to crush his half-smoked cheroot on the coffee tray, she took alarm, glided towards the piano, opened it in tremendous haste, and struck the keys before she sat down. In an instant the veranda, the whole carpetless wooden bungalow raised on piles, became filled with an uproarious, confused resonance. But through it all she heard, she felt on the floor, the heavy, prowling footsteps of the lieutenant moving to and fro at her back. He was not exactly drunk, but he was sufficiently primed to make the suggestion of his excited imagination seem perfectly feasible and even clever, beautifully, unscrupulously clever. Freya, aware that he had stopped just behind her, went on playing without turning her head. She played with spirit, brilliantly, a fierce piece of music, but when his voice reached her, she went cold all over. It was the voice, not the words. The insolent familiarity of tone dismayed her to such an extent that she could not understand at first what he was saying. His utterance was thick, too. Of course I suspected something of your little goings-on. I'm not a child. But from suspecting to seeing, you understand, there's an enormous difference. That sort of thing. Come, one isn't made of stone, and when a man has been worried by a girl, as I've been worried by you, Miss Freya, sleeping and waking, then of course, but I am a man of the world. It must be dull for you here. I say, won't you leave off this confounded playing? This last was the only sentence really which she made out. She shook her head negatively, and in desperation put on the loud pedal, but she could not make the sound of the piano cover his raised voice. Only I'm surprised that you should. An English trading skipper, a common fellow, low, cheeky lot, infesting these islands. I should make short work of such trash. Why, you have here a good friend, a gentleman ready to worship at your feet, your pretty feet, an officer, a man of family. Strange, isn't it? But what of that? You're fit for a prince. Freya did not turn her head. Her face went stiff with horror and indignation. This adventure was altogether beyond her conception of what was possible. It was not in her character to jump up and run away. It seemed to her, too, that if she did move, there was no saying what might happen. Presently her father would be back, and then the other would have to leave off. It was best to ignore. She went on playing loudly and correctly, as though she were alone, as if Heemskirk did not exist. That proceeding irritated him. Come, you may deceive your father, he bawled angrily, but I'm not to be made a fool of. Stop this infernal noise. Freya! Hey, you Scandinavian goddess of love, stop. Do you hear? That's what you are, of love. But the heathen gods are only devils in disguise, and that's what you are too, a deep little devil. Stop it, I say, or I will lift you off that stool. Standing behind her, he devoured her with his eyes, from the golden crown of her rigidly motionless head to the heels of her shoes, the line of her shapely shoulders, the curves of her fine figure swaying a little before the keyboard. She had on a light dress, the sleeves stopped short at the elbows in an edging of lace. A satin ribbon encircled her waist. In an access of irresistible, reckless hopefulness, he clapped both his hands on that waist, and then the irritating music stopped at last. But quick as she was in springing away from the contact, the round music stool going over with a crash, Heemskirk's lips, aiming at her neck, landed a hungry, smacking kiss just under her ear. A deep silence reigned for a time, and then he laughed rather feebly. He was disconcerted somewhat by her white, still face, the big, light, violet eyes resting on him stonily. She had not uttered a sound. She faced him, steadying herself on the corner of the piano with one extended hand. The other went on rubbing with mechanical persistency the place his lips had touched. "What's the trouble?" he said, offended. "Startled you? Look here, don't let us have any of that nonsense. You don't mean to say a kiss frightens you so much as all that? I know better. I don't mean to be left out in the cold." He had been gazing into her face with such strained intentness that he could no longer see it distinctly. Everything round him was rather misty. He forgot the overturned stool, caught his foot against it, and lurched forward slightly, saying in an ingratiating tone, "I'm not bad fun, really. You try a few kisses to begin with." He said no more, because his head received a terrific concussion, accompanied by an explosive sound. Freya had swung her round, strong arm with such force that the impact of her open palm on his flat cheek turned him half round. Uttering a faint, hoarse yell, the lieutenant clapped both his hands to the left side of his face, which had taken on suddenly a dusky brick-red tinge. Freya, very erect, her violet eyes darkened, her palm still tingling from the blow, a sort of restrained, determined smile showing a tiny gleam of her white teeth, heard her father's rapid, heavy tread on the path below the veranda. Her expression lost its pugnacity and became sincerely concerned. She was sorry for her father. She stooped quickly to pick up the music stool, as if anxious to obliterate the traces. But that was no good. She had resumed her attitude, one hand resting lightly on the piano, before old Nelson got up the top of the stairs. Poor father! How furious he will be! How upset! And afterwards, what tremors! What unhappiness! Why had she not been open with him from the first? His round, innocent stare of amazement cut her to the quick. But he was not looking at her. His stare was directed to Heemskirk, who, with his back to him, and with his hand still up to his face, was hissing curses through his teeth, and, as she saw him in profile, glaring at her balefully with one black, evil eye. "What's the matter?" asked old Nelson, very much bewildered. She did not answer him. She thought of Jasper on the deck of the brig, gazing up at the lighted bungalow, and she felt frightened. It was a mercy that one of them at least was on board, out of the way. She only wished he were 100 miles off, and yet she was not certain that she did. Had Jasper been mysteriously moved that moment to reappear on the veranda, she would have thrown her consistency, her firmness, her self-possession to the winds, and flown into his arms. "What is it? What is it?" insisted the unsuspecting Nelson, getting quite excited. "Only this minute you were playing a tune, and—" Freya, unable to speak in her apprehension of what was coming, she was also fascinated by that black, evil, glaring eye, only nodded slightly at the lieutenant, as much as to say, "Just look at him." "Why, yes," exclaimed old Nelson, "I see. What on earth—" Meantime he had cautiously approached Heemskirk, who, bursting into incoherent imprecations, was stamping with both feet where he stood. The indignity of the blow, the rage of baffled purpose, the ridicule of the exposure, and the impossibility of revenge maddened him to a point where he simply felt he must howl with fury. "Oh!" he howled, stamping across the veranda, as though he meant to drive his foot through the floor at every step. "Why, is his face hurt?" asked the astounded old Nelson. The truth dawned suddenly upon his innocent mind. "Dear me," he cried, enlightened. "Get some brandy, quick, Freya. You are subject to it, Lieutenant? Fiendish, eh? I know. Used to go crazy all of a sudden myself in the time. And a little bottle of laudanum from the medicine chest, too. Freya, look sharp. Don't you see he's got a toothache?" And indeed, what other explanation could have presented itself to the guileless old Nelson, beholding this cheek nursed with both hands, these wild glances, these stampings, this distracted swaying of the body? It would have demanded a preternatural acuteness to hit upon the true cause. Freya had not moved. She watched Heemskirk's savagely inquiring black stare directed stealthily upon herself. "Aha, you would like to be let off," she said to herself. She looked at him unflinchingly, thinking it out. The temptation of making an end of it all without further trouble was irresistible. She gave an almost imperceptible nod of assent and glided away. "Hurry up that brandy," old Nelson shouted as she disappeared in the passage. Heemskirk relieved his deeper feelings by a sudden string of curses in Dutch and English which he sent after her. He raved to his heart's content, flinging to and fro the veranda and kicking chairs out of the way, while Nelson, or Nielsen, whose sympathy was profoundly stirred by these evidences of agonizing pain, hovered round his dear and dreaded lieutenant, fussing like an old hen. Dear me, is it so bad? I know well what it is. I used to frighten my poor wife sometimes. Do you get it often like this, Lieutenant? Heemskirk shouldered him viciously out of his way with a short, insane laugh. But his staggering host took it in good part. A man beside himself with excruciating toothache is not responsible. "Go to my room, Lieutenant," he suggested urgently. "Throw yourself on my bed. We will get something to ease you in a minute." He seized the poor sufferer by the arm and forced him gently onwards to the very bed on which Heemskirk, in a renewed access of rage, flung himself down with such force that he rebounded from the mattress to the height of quite a foot. "Dear me!" exclaimed the scared Nelson, and incontinently ran off to hurry up the brandy and the laudanum, very angry that so little alacrity was shown in relieving the torture of his precious guest. In the end he got these things himself. Half an hour later he stood by the inner passage of the house, surprised by faint, spasmodic sounds of a mysterious nature, between laughter and sobs. He frowned, then he went straight towards his daughter's room and knocked at the door. Freya, her glorious fair hair framing her white face and rippling down a dark blue dressing gown, opened it partly. The light in the room was dim. Antonia, crouching in a corner, rocked herself backwards and forwards, uttering feeble moans. Old Nelson had not much experience in various kinds of feminine laughter, but he was certain there had been laughter there. Very unfeeling, he said with weighty displeasure. "What is there so amusing in a man being in pain? I should have thought a woman, a young girl—" "He was so funny," murmured Freya, whose eyes glistened strangely in the semi-obscurity of the passage. "And then you know I don't like him," she added in an unsteady voice. "Funny," repeated old Nelson, amazed at this evidence of callousness in one so young. "You don't like him? Do you mean to say that, because you don't like him, you— Why, it's simply cruel. Don't you know it's about the worst sort of pain there is? Dogs have been known to go mad with it." "He certainly seemed to have gone mad," Freya said with an effort, as if she was struggling with some hidden feeling. But her father was launched. "And you know how he is. He notices everything. He is a fellow to take offence for the least little thing, regular Dutchman, and I want to keep friendly with him. It's like this, my girl, if that Rajah of ours were to do something silly, and you know he is a sulky, rebellious beggar, and the authorities took it into their head that my influence over him wasn't good, you would find yourself without a roof over your head." She cried, "What nonsense, father," in a not very assured tone, and discovered that he was angry enough to achieve irony. Yes, old Nelson, or Nielsen, irony, just a gleam of it. "Oh, of course, if you have means of your own, a mansion, a plantation that I know nothing of." But he was not capable of sustained irony. "I tell you they would bundle me out of here," he whispered forcibly. "Without compensation, of course. I know these Dutch. And the lieutenant's just the fellow to start the trouble going. He has the ear of influential officials. I wouldn't defend him for anything, on no consideration whatsoever. What do you say?" It was only an inarticulate exclamation. If she ever had a half-formed intention of telling him everything, she had given it up now. It was impossible, both out of regard for his dignity and for the peace of his poor mind. "I don't care for him myself very much," old Nelson's subdued undertone confessed in a sigh. "He's easier now," he went on after a silence. "I've given him up my bed for the night. I shall sleep on my veranda, in the hammock. No, I can't say I like him either, but from that to laugh at a man because he's driven crazy with pain is a long way. You've surprised me, Freya. That side of his face is quite flushed." Her shoulders shook convulsively under his hands, which he laid on her paternally. His straggly, wiry moustache brushed her forehead in a good-night kiss. She closed the door and went away from it to the middle of the room before she allowed herself a tired-out sort of laugh without buoyancy. "Flushed, a little flushed," she repeated to herself. "I hope so, indeed, a little." Her eyelashes were wet. Antonia in her corner moaned and giggled, and it was impossible to tell where the moans ended and the giggles began. The mistress and the maid had been somewhat hysterical, for Freya, on fleeing into her room, had found Antonia there and had told her everything. "I have avenged you, my girl," she exclaimed. And then they had laughingly cried and cryingly laughed, with admonitions, "Shh, not so loud, be quiet," on one part, and interludes of "I'm so frightened, he is an evil man," on the other. Antonia was very much afraid of Heemskirk. She was afraid of him because of his personal appearance, because of his eyes and his eyebrows and his mouth and his nose and his limbs. Nothing could be more rational. And she thought him an evil man because to her eyes he looked evil. No ground for an opinion could be sounder. In the dimness of the room, with only a nightlight burning at the head of Freya's bed, the camarista crept out of her corner to crouch at the feet of her mistress, supplicating in whispers, "'Tis the brig, Captain Allen. Let us run away at once. Oh, let us run away. I am so frightened. Let us. I run away, thought Freya to herself without looking down at the scared girl. Never. Both the resolute mistress under the mosquito net and the frightened maid lying curled up on a mat at the foot of the bed did not sleep very well that night. The person that did not sleep at all was Lieutenant Heemskirk. He lay on his back, staring vindictively in the darkness. Inflaming images and humiliating reflections succeeded each other in his mind, keeping up, augmenting his anger. A pretty tale this to get about, but it must not be allowed to get about. The outrage had to be swallowed in silence. A pretty affair, fooled, led on, and struck by the girl, and probably fooled by the father too. But no, Nielsen was but another victim of that shameless hussy, that brazen minx, that sly, laughing, kissing, lying... No, he did not deceive me on purpose, thought the tormented lieutenant. But I should like to pay him off all the same for being such an imbecile. Well, some day perhaps. One thing he was firmly resolved on. He had made up his mind to steal early out of the house. He did not think he could face the girl without going out of his mind with fury. Fire and perdition, 10,000 devils! I shall choke her here before the morning, he muttered to himself, lying rigid on his back on old Nelson's bed, his breast heaving for air. He arose at daylight and started cautiously to open the door. Faint sounds in the passage alarmed him, and remaining concealed he saw Freya coming out. This unexpected sight deprived him of all powers to move away from the crack of the door. It was the narrowest crack possible, but commanding the view of the end of the veranda. Freya made for that end hastily to watch the brig passing the point. She wore her dark dressing gown. Her feet were bare, because, having fallen asleep towards the morning, she ran out headlong in her fear of being too late. Heemskirk had never seen her looking like this, with her hair drawn back smoothly to the nape of her neck, and hanging in one heavy fair tress down her back, and with that air of extreme youth, intensity, and eagerness. And at first he was amazed, and then he gnashed his teeth. He could not face her at all. He muttered a curse, and kept still behind the door. With a low, deep-breathed "ah," when she first saw the brig already under way, she reached for Nelson's long glass reposing on brackets high up the wall. The wide sleeve of the dressing-gown slipped back, uncovering her white arm as far as the shoulder. Heemskirk, gripping the door-handle as if to crush it, felt like a man just risen to his feet from a drinking bout. And Freya knew that he was watching her. She knew. She had seen the door move as she came out of the passage. She was aware of his eyes being on her, with scornful bitterness, with triumphant contempt. "You are there," she thought, levelling the long glass. "Oh, well, look on, then." The green islets appeared like black shadows. The ashen sea was smooth as glass. The clear robe of the colourless dawn, in which even the brig appeared shadowy, had a hem of light in the east. Directly Freya had made out Jasper on deck, with his own long glass directed to the bungalow, she laid hers down, and raised both the beautiful white arms above her head. In that attitude of supreme cry she stood still, glowing with the consciousness of Jasper's adoration going out to her figure held in the field of his glass away there, and warmed too by the feeling of evil passion, the burning, covetous eyes of the other fastened on her back. In the fervour of her love, in the caprice of her mind, and with that mysterious knowledge of masculine nature women seem to be born to, she thought. You are looking on. You will. You must. Then you shall see something. She brought both her hands to her lips, then flung them out, sending a kiss over the sea as if she wanted to throw her heart along with it on the deck of the brig. Her face was rosy, her eyes shone. Her repeated, passionate gesture seemed to fling kisses by the hundred, again and again and again, while the slowly ascending sun brought the glory of colour to the world, turning the islets green, the sea blue, the brig below her white, dazzlingly white in the spread of her wings, with the red ensign streaming like a tiny flame from the peak. And each time she murmured with a rising inflection, "Take this, and this, and this," till suddenly her arms fell. She had seen the ensign dipped in response, and next moment the point below hid the hull of the brig from her view. Then she turned away from the balustrade, and passing slowly before the door of her father's room, with her eyelids lowered and an enigmatic expression on her face, she disappeared behind the curtain. But instead of going along the passage, she remained concealed and very still on the other side to watch what would happen. For some time the broad, furnished veranda remained empty. Then the door of old Nelson's room came open suddenly, and Heemskirk staggered out. His hair was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot, his unshaven face looked very dark. He gazed wildly about, saw his cap on the table, snatched it up, and made for the stairs quietly, but with a strange tottering gait, like the last effort of waning strength. Shortly after his head had sunk below the level of the floor, Freya came out from behind the curtain, with compressed, scheming lips, and no softness at all in her luminous eyes. He could not be allowed to sneak off scot-free. Never, never. She was excited. She tingled all over. She had tasted blood. He must know that he had been seen slinking off shamefully. But to run to the front rail and shout after him would have been childish, crude, undignified. And to shout what? What word? What phrase? No, it was impossible. Then how? She frowned, discovered it, dashed at the piano, which had stood open all night, and made the rosewood monster growl savagely in an irritated bass. She struck chords as if firing shots after that straddling broad figure in ample white trousers and a dark uniform jacket with gold shoulder straps, and then she pursued him with the same thing she had played the evening before, a modern, fierce piece of love music which had been tried more than once against the thunderstorms of the group. She accentuated its rhythm with triumphant malice, so absorbed in her purpose that she did not notice the presence of her father, who, wearing an old threadbare ulster of a check pattern over his sleeping suit, had run out from the back veranda to inquire the reason of this untimely performance. He stared at her. "What on earth, Freya?" His voice was nearly drowned by the piano. "What's become of the lieutenant?" he shouted. She looked up at him as if her soul were lost in her music, with unseeing eyes. "Gone." "What? Where?" She shook her head slightly and went on playing louder than before. Old Nelson's innocently anxious gaze, starting from the open door of his room, explored the whole place high and low, as if the lieutenant were something small which might have been crawling on the floor or clinging to a wall. But a shrill whistle coming somewhere from below pierced the ample volume of sound rolling out of the piano in great vibrating waves. The lieutenant was down at the cove, whistling for the boat to come and take him off to his ship. And he seemed to be in a terrific hurry too, for he whistled again almost directly, waited for a moment, and then sent out a long, interminable, shrill call as distressful to hear as though he had shrieked without drawing breath. Freya ceased playing suddenly. "Going on board," said old Nelson, perturbed by the event. "What could have made him clear out so early? Queer chap, devilishly touchy too. I shouldn't wonder if it was your conduct last night that hurt his feelings. I noticed you, Freya. You as well as laughed in his face while he was suffering agonies from neuralgia. It isn't the way to get yourself liked. He's offended with you." Freya's hands now reposed passive on the keys. She bowed her fair head, feeling a sudden discontent, a nervous latitude, as though she had passed through some exhausting crisis. Old Nelson, or Nielsen, looking aggrieved, was resolving matters of policy in his bald head. "I think it would be right for me to go on board, just to inquire, sometime this morning," he declared fussily. "Why don't they bring me my morning tea? Do you hear, Freya? You have astonished me, I must say. I didn't think a young girl could be so unfeeling. And the lieutenant thinks himself a friend of ours, too. What? No? Well, he calls himself a friend, and that's something to a person in my position, certainly. Oh, yes, I must go on board." "Must you?" murmured Freya listlessly, then added in her thought, "Poor man." End of chapter 4.
Thank you for listening to this chapter. If you'd like to keep following this story or discover more fascinating tales, be sure to subscribe to our channel and enable notifications. We look forward to sharing the next exciting chapter with you. Until next time.